So good morning to you all. Thank you for attending this session. We will have a 20 minutes presentation for each of you, and followed by the 10 minutes question and answer. But please feel free to make questions on the chat box, or raise your hand at the final of the presentation. So I will give the floor to Rosalind, which will be presenting the paper Imagine Academic Futures, Connections and Complexities in the Move to Online Teaching. So the floor is yours, Rosalind. Thank you.
Lovely, Sonia. Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone, and good morning if that's the time for you. It's 11:45 at night for me, so so bear with me. What I'm presenting on is the early findings or emerging findings from a fellowship supported by Deakin University's Centre for Research in Assessment and Digital Learning. This was a fellowship project that I've led with the support of my mentors. It's very nice at my stage of life, academic life, to have mentors, Margaret Bierman and Rolla Rajawi, and with the support of 3 research fellows, Caridwen Owen, Maeve Noonan and Rachel Finneran. This is a 2023 project, so all quite new and recent. And it came out of my interest in the fact that while digital teaching practices, as we all know, or we've talked about this in some of the earlier sessions, and tools and technologies that just become part of the fabric of our lives in higher education, especially in the teaching space, they're still the subject of some pretty complex and affective academic responses and critiques. And that critique is not slowing down. It reached a kind of maybe a peak in the earlier stage of the COVID pandemic, but really there's ongoing concern and critique about our attachment to the digital as a framework for teaching and learning. And one of the concerns that I'm particularly interested in is not the practicalities of that implementation, or even the experience of students and teaching academics. That's important, but it's been well covered by an enormous body of literature. I'm especially interested in critiques that question or challenge the particular discourses or imaginaries of the digital that may underpin the development and ongoing implementation of digital strategies in higher education. So what do I mean by imaginaries, in particular collective imaginaries? Drawing on the theoretical literature that's been in place for some years now, coming off the back of Charles Taylor's work, amongst others, I'm understanding, and the project understands, collective imaginaries as something that are things that are collectively held, that are stable, that are publicly performed visions of desirable futures, but at the same time are constantly being shaped and reshaped by social forces, that are a sort of curious mix, as Basil Risby said some years ago, of the imperial and the affective, and that create shared frameworks of belief, in this case amongst academics, but at the same time are shaped by those with power or influence. So the research questions that have guided the project are these, coming off the back of what I've just said. Firstly, what collective imaginaries shape the recent and future development and implementation of online teaching in Australian and United Kingdom universities? And what's discursively produced by these imaginaries? How do senior academics who have a role in shaping these collective imaginaries both look back to understand and think about teaching practice before the advent of the pandemic, and that rapid overnight move to online teaching? And at the same time, how do they look forward to imagine both their own academic futures and the future of higher education as a whole? The methodology was fairly simple. I conducted interviews with a deliberately small sample, a purposive sample of 11 senior academics from a range of Australian and UK universities and from across disciplinary areas. And following that theme of my interest in the leaders, really what I wanted in this project was a view or a voice from what we might consider the top of the tree, the top of the higher education tree. So my participants at the time of the interviews, they were deans or executive deans, they were faculty heads or heads of school, they were emeritus or emerita professors or directors of centres, and all of them were recognised scholars in relation to the themes of the project. Why Australia and the United Kingdom? Two main reasons. Firstly, because, as you know, and as I know, universities in both nations, were very subject to that very rapid overnight adoption, widespread adoption of digitally driven teaching very early in the pandemic, and also because there is such a large and still evolving and burgeoning body of debate and scholarship about the resulting implications for academic identities and practices and the cultures of universities. So keeping that focus on the temporal themes of this project, in the interviews, I invited my participants to think and talk temporally, and at the same time to focus on their own experience that recognises that, as Margaret Bierman has said, rich data is experiential data. So I invited them to think back to their own early academic experiences. Again, as senior seasoned academics, they have typically got long-standing careers in higher education. I asked them to reflect on their present experiences as leaders in their institutions and the sector, and I asked them to think forward to possible academic and digital futures. I also used a photo voice methodology drawing on Carol Taylor's wonderful work with Suzanne Gannon as an attempt to capture what they call the small stories, the everyday moments, the mundane, emergent, unforeseen, and happenstance events of academic life. And mirroring that temporal focus, I asked participants to share 3 photographs, one of academic life in the past, one of academic life as they experience it now, and one that captures their imagined academic future. I'm flagging this, I'm not actually sharing the images now, they're still under analysis, but that might come back into the conversation. My analysis of the data is very much driven by or informed by Braun and Clark's approach. I am an academic. I am interviewing other academics, although I'm not as senior as the people that I interviewed. Nonetheless, I think it was an important decision to choose an analytic framework that recognises the degree to which I'm implicated in the data. So Braun and Clark's reflexive thematic analysis stance recognises that researchers' subjectivity and reflexivity is not just incidental to the analysis of the data, but it's a central resource, and that the themes and the analysis are actively created by the researcher. They don't just magically emerge from the data. So I'm going to quickly share 4 of the most prevalent themes that I believe are emerging from the data to date, using pseudonyms that were chosen by the participants. The first thing that really emerges out of the data is the idea of moral purpose. There's this message, or there's this theme, or there's this imaginary of the digital that's held by the academic leaders I interviewed, that the digital has moral potential. So John, Vanessa and David really spoke to the potential of the digital to democratise higher education, teaching and learning, to make knowledge accessible not only to as many people as possible, but to people who otherwise may not be able to access it. David, who's no lover of the digital, actually says, you know, it's good if it enables accessibility, but it's not good in and of itself. It's only valuable as far as it enables that kind of democratic access to knowledge. At the same time, there was a real concern held by some of my participants about the threat to that moral purpose. And there was more than one. But one particular concern was the role increasingly played by large edtech companies in the sector and their capacity or power to drive the imaginaries of teaching and learning and of higher education in the sector. As Isaac said, these companies have the power to do a huge amount of imaginary construction, and we're seduced by that. That may mean that we end up prioritising certain imaginaries that may in turn silence other educational imaginaries, like that imaginary of access and equity, but also like the imaginary of other forms, wider forms, cross-border forms of teaching and learning. The second theme that really is emerging from the data, and it relates a little to the first, is a concern among my participants, my very senior, seasoned academic leaders, that the digital may be driving rather than serving the purposes of higher education. So John is concerned that everything is seen through the lens of technology rather than through the lens of what we're actually trying to achieve educationally as educators. He cautions, putting stuff online in and of itself doesn't offer people an education. And in fact, he says that kind of thinking is really dangerous. It completely takes away the educational expertise of academics. So his concern is that the digital, taken to its sort of, possible extent of implementation, takes the academic out of the picture. And Isaac had a similar warning. He's very concerned about the digital, the potential of the digital in higher education teaching and learning to drive the nature of our work, then the nature of teaching, and perhaps the nature of knowledge as well, and even what is valuable knowledge. The third theme that won't surprise any of us we all experienced the pandemic, presumably within higher education. It came back to that really important theme within our own experience and within the scholarship about the relationality of higher education. And there were differing views among my participants about whether the digital is, and might in future either enhance or disrupt and threaten the relationalities that are inherent in teaching and learning. So we've seen an enormous scholarly literature over the past few years, since 2020, documenting academic anxieties about the loss of relationship, about the loss of grounded, situated, connected relational experience, about the loss of life on campus, about the normalisation of what Bakhtiar calls the normalisation of dematerialised teaching, and about what that might mean for us going forward. One of my participants, Melisande, felt very, very strongly, very passionately, she actually became quite emotional about this during the interview, that the advent of, that the spread of the digital, that the domination, if you like, of higher education teaching and learning by the digital has enabled what she calls the structural erosion of opportunities for relationality. And she describes her own university, but also her imagined future university in pretty dark terms. as a place of alienation and atomization and impoverished forms of connectedness. And there was definitely a sense of grief, a sense of loss among a number of the participants. That again echoes the experience that many of us have had the last few years. But there's also another view. So for James Bond, another of my participants, the digital is actually the road to connection. He argues that connectivity is absolutely central to digital teaching and learning, that in fact it enables connections and relationships between people, between lecturers, teachers and students, amongst academic colleagues and amongst and between students in a way that we couldn't have had, that wasn't possible previously. And the fourth thing,
for 5 more minutes.
Thank you very much.
Minutes.
The fourth thing that really sort of leapt out of the data related to what my participants clearly see as the moral duty of academics. So there was this message, there was this theme, there was this belief, there was this sort of stated view amongst my participants that academics need to not be taken hostage, if you like, by commercial or political imaginaries of the digital, but they need to work together to imagine or even reimagine and co-construct the most desirable higher education futures. So they talked about the need, again, echoing a lot of the recent scholarship, to actively participate in imagining the digital future of higher education, to enable a transformative future and not just a kind of cementing of hegemonic needs and agendas. And their view is very much that this is work we should be doing collectively. So Vanessa said, what I hope is that we can all be together much more agentic and sophisticated and collective about the role that technology plays. James Bond says, and there's the emphasis on we need to look at the change. We need to imagine the possibilities rather than avert our gaze. That's the big act of imagination that's required to actually stare the digital and its affordances in the face. So how do we wrap up those themes and those views? I mean, it seems pretty clear, and this is not groundbreaking news. You know, I think we're all aware that digital technologies and practices and tools, they bring the promise of new teaching practices, new policies, new understandings of knowledge, but they may also threaten or challenge or rupture these. And that for many academics, they are a challenge or a disruption to academic labour and identity. Certainly what my little study suggests is that we are still in a period where the views about this are very polarised or very binary. I also just wanted to sort of quickly note in passing, when my participants when I asked them, to talk about the digital future of higher education, a lot of what they said, a lot of what I've, briefly shared with you this evening, could also be read as much about, it could be understood as much about as being concerned with the future of higher education as a whole, writ large. I think a lot of their concerns and their hopes are really about what it means to be an academic and what they see as critical times. And I think that raises interesting questions about how the digital is being imagined by these academics who have influence, where really what they're imagining, what they're expressing concern and hope about is where we're heading as a sector rather than where we're heading in relation to the digital. So I'm just going to close with reflections from another participant, from Cliff, who I thought raised some really interesting questions that don't particularly have easy answers. And this is what he said when asked to reflect on, the future of the digital and higher education. I think crucially at a fundamental level, there's something here where we need to have a discussion of what it is to be an academic. How do we come to terms with who we are? And how do we allow ourselves to embrace change, given the fragility and the frailty of our self-concept and the lack of clarity in terms of professional identity and what's involved in cultivating that identity? Thank you very much, and I will stop sharing now.
Thank you so much, Rosalind, for this very interesting presentation. I now open the floor for questions and answers, comments. You can also write okay, we have Mark. Mark, please.
Yeah, thank you, Rosalind, for excellent talk. I really enjoyed it. And one thing I was wondering about is you were talking about, I noted especially James's comment on connectivity being essential to digital learning. And I was wondering if your participants talked at all, and I know this wasn't your focus, but about connectivity between colleagues and connectivity within the organization and among staff. That's an area that I'm interested in. And so I was wondering if there were any sort of comments on that, because especially so many of us are working now in a hybrid environment. And so just trying to build connections in that. And was there anything in your data on that?
Yes, yeah. And thanks, Mark, and hello again. Yes, there certainly was. So again, really sort of mixed views and narratives and stories, ranging from people who felt that the academic community, the community of scholars and academics, hadn't really sort of yet recovered or regrouped as a collective, as a connected collective from those really isolated days of the early pandemic. So there was one strong view on the one hand that in fact, yeah, there was quite a lot about this. So there was there was a sense of grief and loss amongst some participants, that in fact the digital was being employed or being used or else had simply evolved into a mechanism that meant that connections between and amongst academics remained few, far between, impoverished. So Melisande, one of my participants, again became very emotional when she was talking about her first post-pandemic conference and the beauty and the importance about physically being in a place with colleagues. Another participant, Marcus, talked about really poetically about people, that the presence, the physical presence of people in the room together, that is what it's all about. That's what academic life is all about. As a kind of counter to that, there was this almost sort of utopian imagining. I think it was more a future, more cast as a future possibility than something that's really being realised in the present. But there was a narrative by some participants that the digital could really drive and facilitate, cross-border connections amongst and between academics, in ways that they saw as being extremely productive and connecting. So no one view.
Thank you. We have a question from Karen. Karen, please. Karen, please, you have raised your hand.
Sorry, I couldn't find the mute. Yes, I can't find the camera now either. I'm not so familiar with Zoom. Hello, hi, hello. I'm interested in the methods that you use, the photo voice in particular, and wondered, you said you're in the process of analysing your photographs, and I just wondered if you can say anything about how you're going about doing that.
So there's this, beautiful methodological literature. Again, Taylor and Gannon have written in detail. I really love their work. So that they've written in great detail about a really nuanced approach that they've brought to the analysis of photographic material, photo voice material. I have to confess that I am not using anything like as sophisticated a strategy as they are. So I am analysing the images that have been shared, firstly as sort of standalone images, for what they evoke, but then as a sort of secondary layer to that, trying to look at them as looking at them as a collective. So again, in much the same way that that we might approach the written or the spoken data of the transcripts, the interviews, really looking at commonalities, at tensions, at the the relationship between and amongst those images. I mean, it's just worth noting, and it is one of the reasons why I'm not highlighting the photo voice data in this particular presentation. More than half of my participants declined to share photographs at all. Now, I respect that. Of course I do. But it was an interesting phenomenon. And certainly some of the other studies that I've looked at, and in fact, there were presentations earlier. For me, it's this evening. I keep saying this evening. And anyway, earlier in the conference, there's certainly been plenty of other studies where participants were seemed quite willing to share photos, whether it was because my participants were, so senior, so busy. And quite a few of them did just say, look, I'm sorry, I haven't got the time to do that. So that photo voice data, which I hoped would add a lot of nuance and dimension to the spoken narratives, has ended up being considerably more thin than I was expecting or hoping.
Thank you. Did the you've mentioned that some of the participants just said they didn't have time, but the others who declined your offer of providing photographs, did they give any other reasons?
Not specifically, but there was a sense that it was something that they just weren't interested in doing. And I'm not meaning to phrase that in a way that sounds, in any way, anything less than respectful. But there was definitely sort of a sense of, yes, that's not of interest. Let's say it wasn't of interest to them to do that. And perhaps, perhaps they didn't, I mean, one of the if you like, prerequisites for real participant engagement in a study like this, and in a process like photo voice, there has to be a little bit of affective, little bit of emotional investment. Usually people will participate; they'll go to that extra length because they feel that there's an interesting investigation or reflexive journey for them. I think perhaps for these, uber academics who are already, writing, really, leading the scholarship in the field, perhaps that wasn't something they felt that they needed to engage in.
Yeah, thank you.
Pleasure.
Sonia, you're on mute.
Sorry. Thank you so much for the questions and the answers. And we have time, 2 minutes for the last question from Penny. Please, Penny.
Hi, everyone. Thanks very much, Rosalind, and thank you, Sonia. So my question, Rosalind, was, I wonder if digital literacy, digital skills, and different levels in either self-confidence or actual capacity and came up at all and had an influence in the responses that, maybe different demographics or professors from different disciplines gave to you.
And So thanks for the question, Penny. That was, I mean, that's actually been one of the things that interested me, that that at the moment, I mean, these are overwhelmingly, you know, academics with a very high degree of digital literacy and knowledge. I mean, they're really leading the field. But, you know, I was looking for difference. I was looking for patterns. I looked for difference along gender lines. I looked for difference along discipline lines. I was certainly looking for difference between Australian and UK academics. And at least at the moment, one of the more surprising, you know, findings for me was that those differences weren't strong. The only difference that really emerges for me out of the data, and it's not the one that you've mentioned, is that, and I hope this doesn't offend anyone, but there was a much darker view amongst my United Kingdom, my UK interviewees, of, you know, much sort of darker cast in terms of both the experience of their institutions during COVID, but the post-COVID experience as well. There was a much sort of, much greater, much sort of heavier burden of concern about where higher education is going to as a sector. Not that the Australians were, you know, blithely skipping around full of optimism, but certainly the sort of mood amongst the UK participants was a good deal more grim.
Thank you so much, Rosalind. We have to finish. I'm so sorry. If Penny, if you have further questions besides this one, I advise you to contact Rosalind. I don't know if Rosalind wants to leave her email on the chat box for people to ask other questions or something. So thank you so much, Rosalind. And we move forward to the second presentation, which will be the one from Jennifer League, I suppose. What does it mean to belong in the physical sciences?
Hi, we were down to be last, and I'm actually waiting.
Yes, I know, but
I'm waiting for my PhD student who's supposed to be leading on this one.
No problem at all. I had the information that you are going to be the second, but I see Sarah there. So Sarah, are you up to? You manage the problems to your presentation?
Yeah, so I was having problems sharing the slides, but I've just had an email from the IT support saying they're going to share them on my behalf.
Okay, so which one of you is going to? So is this one? Okay.
Yes.
So it's going to be Sarah. Sarah, 20 minutes for your presentation, whenever you feel like it.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
All right. Yes, thank you. So the paper I'm giving today is based on an article that Tanya and I have just published in Educational Review, the focus of which is to ask who are our university leaders, with a particular emphasis on elite universities. So the next slide, please. So vice-chancellors, presidents or rectors occupy elite public positions in universities globally. And if we take a cursory glance at the roll call of names across the top 100 universities, so for example, if we take the higher education ranking, that only 25% of women hold this position. And what we see internationally is the dominance of men, and particularly in Western contexts, the dominance of white men. So the presentation is based on the article, and it reflects upon who is included and who is therefore excluded from senior leadership roles in elite universities in the 21st century academy. Next slide, please. So we have extensive research which indicates that ways of doing leadership are both deeply gendered and racialized. And equality, diversity and inclusion discourses are commodified in order to satisfy recruitment rather than appointment policies. So it's very much about the individual. The role is focused around the individual, and this notion of that individual being a cultural fit for the organization. Next slide, please. So our argument is that in order to radically diversify higher education, we need to ask a different set of questions, and they need to be asked about the absence of marginalised groups in elite roles. What we're suggesting is we need to interrogate the inevitable bias of recruitment practices, and particularly focus upon how formal and informal merit, what we're calling trajectories of merit, reinforce, not displace the status quo. So in querying discourses of merit and troubling what we're calling the facade of diversity, we take an intersectional approach, which I hope will come out further throughout this presentation, by moving beyond singular and, importantly, conventional forms of discrimination. Next slide, please. So before moving on, let us just briefly reflect on the idea of merit and the meritocratic ideal, which I'm sure we're all very familiar with. So merit is defined as the quality of being particularly good or worthy, especially so as to deserve praise or reward. And the meritocracy is the system in which social mobility and advancement is made based on an individual's merit. Merit equals success. It is the indication of personal effort and performance. So the ideal is that meritocratic societies should provide equality of opportunity to succeed, regardless of social position, socioeconomic class, gender, race, and other such factors. Next slide, please. So before I move on to take you through our arguments in a little more detail, I'd like to just first think about why we're looking at elite universities. Why are we focusing on leadership in the world's most elite universities? Well, this is because of their location in the centre of the global economy of eliteness. On the one hand, these universities espouse a marketised language of diversity. We only have to look at their websites. Yet on the other, their institutional status and privilege remain precisely because discourses of merit are framed as neutral. Next slide, please. So evidence shows that the profiles of those students accessing elite universities is far from diverse, and our hypothesis is that this advantage, evidenced in the student population, is maintained and perpetuated in the highest ranks in elite universities internationally. So what I'm suggesting is, in short, it is a closed, hermetically sealed system of privilege. Next slide, please. So in troubling the facade of diversity, we're suggesting there's a collective sameness about university leaders in elite universities globally, that their public mission to EDI is a form of avatorial, that we can see there's a facade of inclusiveness and neutrality. And importantly, there's a silent and invisible bias which relates to merit and the notion of who is meritorious and who is not. And those minority groups who at some point in their career trajectory pick up those meritocratic credentials which enable them to access this privileged trajectory, then go on to learn the game. Next slide, please. So our thinking theoretically is framed and influenced by the sociology of elites. So what we're suggesting is we need to juxtapose EDI discourses against what constitutes merit. Merit and meritocratic credentials underpin notions of success and this notion of cultural fit. So how does power and privilege operate? So we're saying there is an access advantage which works to reproduce and preserve elites in the world's top universities. So what do we currently know about the career trajectories and profiles of those who lead the world's elite universities? Well, this is a point I'm going to come to shortly. Next slide, please. Our theoretical framing is also very importantly framed by intersectionality. So much of the EDI debate centres on singular and conventional forms of disadvantage. However, disadvantage needs to be understood more holistically in terms of the intersectionality of all forms of discrimination. And we're arguing we should extend intersectional analysis by considering how merit intersects with multiple identity vectors to include some, whilst excluding others from university leadership in elite universities. So let us now turn our attention to guild root academics and academic inbreeding. So academic inbreeding has mainly been researched in the context of institutions recruiting their own doctoral students as opposed to the network level, and more specifically in relation to academic recruitment at the highest level of leadership. So here we might consider how the effects of what Macfarlane and Jefferson called guild power overlap with, for example, race, gender, and social class, and of how guild power needs to be considered and understood as a key element of disadvantage. Macfarlane and Jefferson discussed the guild route of elite academics. Their meritocratic credentials include studying for a PhD on a full-time basis at an elite research-intensive university, usually preceded by a BA and an MA at an elite institution. And this guild route in the context of the UK is instructive here. So in a recent media article entitled "Why are Post-92 Students Excluded from So Many Postdoctoral Schemes?", E.D. Nicholson drew our attention to the absence of opportunities to advance her academic career as a PhD student at a post-92 institution in the UK, and who was not funded by the UK Research and Innovation Bunnies, the majority of which we know, research demonstrates this, is allocated to students studying at Russell Group universities. So for our international colleagues, just to be clear that post-92 institutions in the UK are the sort of newer universities, and the Russell Group, who would describe themselves as world-class research-intensive universities and would view themselves as elite universities. So could we have the quotation now, please? So this is Edie's quotation, which was in the Times Higher. "I went on to learn that post-92s tend to be excluded from prestigious doctoral training programs, so I was ineligible to apply for many early career research opportunities. I see things like the BBC New Generation Thinker Scheme, which is supposed to be a nationwide search for game-changing academics that will resonate with a wide audience, but actually only seems to find Russell Group researchers." So evident here from the very outset is that gaining the right meritocratic credentials imbue the candidate with the prestige and the symbolic, cultural and social capital of the institution to which they attend. Next slide, please. So in this article, I've been very influenced by Michael Sandel's book, The Tyranny of Merit. And if you haven't read it, I really would recommend it. It's a very compelling piece of work. Sandel's actually looking at the governing elite, particularly in the US and the UK. But I'm sort of taking his line of argument and I'm looking at what it looks like in the context of higher education leadership in elite universities. And so what he's arguing is that elites are unembarrassed by their prejudice. They denounce racism and sexism, but are unapologetic about their negative attitudes towards the less educated. So if you think within the context of higher education, it's about that sort of hierarchy of institutions and how different types of institutions are viewed. Yes, so, no, that's fine. That's fine. Thank you. So what might we observe from the profiles of those who lead the most elite universities? So as illustrative examples in the paper, we considered the biographies of those who were ruling the world's top universities as per the Times Higher Education ranking in 2022. And I think it's interesting because we kept this in the paper, and also I think it's an interesting case study for us to think about. So there we have the University of Oxford, ranked #1, who was led by Louise Richardson, the first woman to take up the mantle of Vice-Chancellor since Vice-Chancellors were recorded in 1230. Prior to this, Richardson had been principal and VC of the University of St Andrews, a top 250 institute, reputationally held in high regard and the choice of the future King and Queen of England. Educated at Trinity College Dublin, UCLA and Harvard, her early career was forged as a Harvard academic. Now, during COVID, there was a public celebration, a virtual public celebration to which I attended, of the appointment of the Hillary Rodham Clinton Chair of Women's History in 2021. And I found this very, very interesting because Richardson commented in relation to her own historic career trajectory, and it is historic, that she was fortunate enough that Oxbridge recognised her degree from Trinity College Dublin. So here we see the implicit recognition of the role of the elite institution. So this is an elite leadership trajectory that could not proceed without imprimatur from Oxbridge. So the California Institute of Technology ranked number 2, led by Thomas Felix Rosenbaum, who was educated at Harvard and Princeton. And prior to his appointment as president, Rosenbaum had served as provost at the University of Chicago, a top 10 institution, where he forged his early career. The president of Harvard, which was ranked jointly second at this time, Lawrence Bacow, on his online biography makes reference to his parents, immigrants to the USA, and whom he describes as the embodiment of the American dream, which signals his faith in the possibility of upward mobility and a meritocracy. Prior to becoming Harvard's 29th president, Bacow had served as president of Tufts University, a top 200 institution, with an education from MIT, Harvard, and an early career again forged at MIT. Stanford, ranked number 4, hit the president, was Mark Tessier Levine, and he received his undergraduate education from McGill and Oxford, his PhD from UCL in the UK, and he served in faculty positions at the University of California and then at Stanford, all top 50 institutions. Prior to taking up the presidency at Stanford, he was the 10th president of the Rockefeller University. Now, delving further into the backgrounds of these elite leaders, that whilst their institutional profiles identify that they were first in family, so that's Levine at Stanford, from immigrant backgrounds, that's Bacow from Harvard, and a woman of colour, which we're going to go on to discuss in a moment, Claudine Gay, who's now become the first Black president of Harvard as of July 2023, nonetheless, each of them hold the right meritocratic credentials to enable them to be leaders of these elite institutions. Now, a further example of the importance of credentialism is evident in an interview which was held with Stephen Tope, who was the University of Cambridge's outgoing VC at that point. Now, he predicted that the number of publicly educated pupils getting to Oxbridge would continue to fail. So this, for our international colleagues, is, fee paying rather than state schools. However, whilst this may signal a commitment to supporting the less privileged on the one hand, on the other, this is set within the context of his own elite profile, educated at Harvard, McGill in Montreal, Cambridge, and a former president of the University of British Columbia, again, another top 50 institution.
5 minutes, Sarah. 5 minutes.
Okay. He notes that he was approached and encouraged to apply for the Cambridge job while Director of Global Affairs at Toronto University, a top 20 institution. So whilst emphasis was placed on him being the first non-British Cambridge VC, again, that's really interesting, this intersection of nationality and then who should or should not be leading these elite institutions. This discussion is set against a typical elite trajectory for those who run the world's most elite universities. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is the picture now since the time of writing the article. So this picture looks entirely different. We've got 2 white males and we've got 3 women and we've got the first Black president of Harvard. So there is much to celebrate in these appointments. However, what we're saying is we need to perhaps take a slightly cautious approach, as there does appear to be what we're calling a facade of diversity. So Irene Tracy, who's at Oxford, was a former warden of Merton College, her alma mater. Aside from a postdoctoral position at Harvard, Tracy was educated and has worked at Oxford her entire career. Deborah Prentice at Cambridge studied at Stanford as an undergraduate, Yale as a postgraduate, and worked at Princeton throughout her academic and leadership career. Similarly, Claudine Gay studied at Stanford for undergraduate education and then moved to Harvard as a postgraduate and then as an academic working at both institutions. Tezia Levine only this year stepped down amidst controversy related to falsified data in academic papers and the way his lab was run. So there's been a big issue about the culture in the way in which his lab was run. So Richard Salla, his replacement, has the same elite trajectory. So we've got Stanford, Provost at the University of Chicago, PhD from Cambridge, etc. So evident here is precisely what Littler has identified, that is the identification, articulation and use of merit as framed within a meritocratic system that views these processes as neutral. A broadening interest in structural inequalities might require elite universities to rethink how they present themselves. But this is within the existing brand rather than positioning themselves, rather than repositioning themselves. And this is a point Bhopal and Myers make in a paper, in their book in 2022. So within our context, whilst there is an outward projection of increasing diversity at this elite level, these leaders continue to be a cultural fit for the elite brand. Next slide, please. So just the concluding comments. So Sandel writes, if meritocracy is the problem, what is the solution? And what are the structural, cultural, institutional issues which need to be addressed? How are unconscious bias conferred through education, credentials, networks, and opportunities? And how might profiles of sameness be interrogated? How can leadership in elite universities be more diverse? And the question, and this is an open question, and one we've struggled with, is it right that the privileged lead the privileged? So if you think Sandel, in his book, he's talking about the governing elite. So he's saying these elite educated leaders, have no understanding of the people who they are serving. They're not diverse enough to bring about democracy for the common good. But in the context of higher education, as we've just said, at elite universities, the profile of the students is often privileged and elite themselves. So in a way, the leaders are actually representing the interests of that privileged student body. So the question is it right that the privileged lead the privileged? Or do we somehow need to break into this, elite system? Next slide, please. So there's the reference to the article. Please do just email me if you'd like a copy of the full paper. And there is my email address, sayston@tees.ac.uk. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you. And thank you for sharing moving the slides on for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for this very, very relevant topic and nice presentation. So the floor is open for questions or comments, please. I can send you an email and you can exchange more ideas, as well as the other here present. So I now will give the floor to the last presentation by Mariam Jacob and Jennifer Leek. What does it mean to belong in the physical sciences? Now is the correct time to present. And I will give you the floor. You have 20 minutes, please.
Good morning, everyone. Can everyone hear me?
With some...
Is it static?
A static, yes, a little bit.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think it's a problem with my device because I'm having the same issue with your device's audio.
Okay, but I think you should try it at least to.
Yeah, should I just go ahead?
I think so.
Sure, thank you. Thank you guys so much for your presentations, and I'm so sorry I've just jumped in quite last minute because of some commitments this morning, but I have my lovely supervisor Jen, who just asked a question, who is with me, and we're doing some research together. So I'm a second year PhD student we're doing some research on belonging in the physical sciences. Actually, our project is a little bit bigger than that. We're looking at academic culture and physical sciences in general. But for this submission, we decided to hone in on the experiences of belonging, which is one of the key themes of our research. So I don't know, Jen, if you can jump in and share the slides on my behalf, because my computer is having a very difficult time this morning. Thank you so much. This is great. Awesome.
Slideshow.
There you go.
Can you see everything, or is it just doing the show?
Yes.
Only the edit screen, not the slideshow. That's it.
There you
Good.
go.
Yes, perfect. Thank you so much. Awesome. So, yeah, my name is Mariam. I'm just entering my second year of my PhD. And one of the things I've been doing is trying to create these visual posters. And I'm so sorry if the audio is terrible right now. But these visual posters to express what our research is about. And obviously my research is standing on the shoulders of Dr. Jennifer Lees and my other supervisors and the rest of the scientific community. But essentially we're looking at this experience of being invited into the physical sciences and then having to go through a journey of developing a scientific identity and deciding actually, is there space for me in this community or not? So, and then the role of microaggressions and unintentional microaggressions. Obviously, sometimes we know that there are definitely cases of intentional microaggression against scientists, but what is the role of these unintentional microaggressions in kind of bursting this bubble, bursting your experiences, and perhaps kicking you right out of the physical sciences, and specifically, obviously, in the area of research? We're not really looking at industry, but we're interested in seeing what the parallel experiences of industry members would be also. So to summarize, that's invitation, identity, and belonging. Thank you, Jennifer. Go off to the next slide. Awesome. So what layers do these things happen in? We're obviously looking at research groups in particular, and I'll go into a little bit of my methodology later. But we're looking at research groups and then the divisions that they exist in within universities and then the institution as a whole. So we're just talking about academic institutions, leading institutions. What does it look like when you zoom out and look at the entire institution as a whole? What are the experiences of invitation, identity, and belonging? And then really, really zooming out and looking at the national research community. So these are the layers we're really looking at. We're gonna look at plate glass universities, post-92 universities, and Russell Group universities, and the experiences are very, very different, as you can imagine. And then we're trying to be very specific. So our project kind of started looking at supramolecular chemistry groups, which are a very specific subfield of organic chemistry. And then we're also branching out into physics at the moment, looking at astrophysics at a few different institutions. So that is really exciting. Thank you, Jennifer. And this is another one of my weird diagrams to kind of explore one of the concepts of belonging and the fact that it isn't a static like my audio concept, but it's something that is quite dynamic. And you know, if someone asked me today my level of belonging in the physical sciences versus last week, I might have a completely different answer, and the answers can change hour by hour, and it's really important that we acknowledge that and take that as an advantage to mean that actually we can change people's experiences of belonging and improve them. Thank you, Jen. Awesome. So this is a wonderful picture of Jen doing some creative methodology in her research, and underneath, so we've done this with academics and we've also done this with school children. So the second picture beneath is some school children holding up some posters that they've made about belonging and diversity in the physical sciences. So what are our broader aims as researchers? Not just to look at belonging, but we're also using, we're social scientists, but Dan has a really strong background in chemistry actually, and I'm a biomedical scientist originally, and all the time I'm spending with chemists at the moment, I'm doing some basic foundation in chemistry as well. So, but ultimately, we're social scientists at the moment anyway. We're using social theory and creative methods to define and revolutionize research culture in physical sciences. We're using social theory and creative methods to explore identity, building and belonging amongst physical scientists, to create intentional opportunities for physical scientists to collaborate in fostering research culture that serves them. So we're really trying to create a bottom-up approach. Calling in support rather than calling out bad behavior, which has often happened in the world of physical sciences, and calling out the bad eggs, if you will, in the physical sciences. We're trying to share best practice across these research groups and across these institutions, some of them Russell, some of them post-92. And we're trying to empower individuals via this bottom-up approach that I've mentioned, to convince them that they can actually create this cultural change without having to first convince their institutions and perhaps convince the entire national research community. They can actually do this on a micro scale themselves that might grow into something bigger. Thank you, Jennifer.
That was the last one.
Ah, awesome. Great. So we can just perhaps talk for a minute about the projects that we have and then maybe take some questions. Just to summarize, we are using these creative methods that perhaps we can go into more detail. Some of them are creative workshops. So sometimes we're using arts and crafts to convince some physical chemists and physicists that they can actually express their experiences and feelings through these methods of art and crafts, which is an interesting one. You know, some of them aren't quite as convinced as we are about the power of art and craft, but it usually does, you know, create these experiences and sharing of experiences between scientists. When you get them in a group and you ask them, what is your experience of belonging? Can you express it using art and craft? And actually it creates really interesting conversations. So that's one thing we do. Another thing we do is film. So you can see a camera tripod here, and we use the power of film and documentary to share these experiences, hopefully on a bigger screen for the world to see. You know, this is the experiences of scientists. Not only can you be one, not only can you become one, but amongst scientists actually, to show them that there are shared experiences of difficult academic culture, and actually this is what we're doing to change it, to show them that people actually care about changing and revolutionizing academic culture in the physical sciences. So that's just a really quick summary of those research methods. I don't know, Jen, if you want to jump in and share a bit more.
Yeah, I was going to say one of the reasons that we, so there's another researcher who's involved in this, Panagiotta or Julie Axelithiotti, who unfortunately can't be here today. And one of the reasons that we kind of wanted to put in this paper here for SRHE was we were sharing our own experiences of our own identity and where we felt that we belonged. So in a sense, the research that Mariam is doing and the research that I've been doing as well is around kind of creating a more equitable and inclusive research culture, so more people feel as though they belong. So in the picture that you can see on screen, there's Hamid Haroon, who is the chair of the National Association for Disabled Staff Networks. He's an awesome human being. And Jessie Boland, who is an FLF at the University of Manchester, is a physicist, also awesome human being. And we were having a discussion and creating a poster all around disability in science, which is one of the areas that I'm very passionate about. But one of the things that Julie and Mariam and I were talking about was like, where do we belong? Because all three of us were trained in science. So Julie and I both have chemistry as our first degrees. Mariam has biomedical science. And yet all three of us are now kind of working in social science, EDIA, equality or equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility. And it's where do we fit? Julie identifies as a chemist still, but has experienced other chemists telling her that she isn't a chemist because she's not in a lab. Although that does rather beg the question of what about computational chemists? They don't have a lab either, so are they chemists or not? I am a full member of the Royal Society of Chemistry, and as much a chemist, I'm a qualified chemistry teacher, but I don't necessarily feel as though I am a chemist. I've got publications in top chemistry journals, but they're on EDI. You know, I'm bringing social science and embodied methods into chemistry, but I don't know where I fit necessarily. And even within social science, because I've been publishing in science journals, it's like, where do I fit? Where do I actually belong? Who am I talking to? Where is my work cited? Not where is my work cited? Where does my work fit best? And Mariam and I were talking about this just last week, weren't we? Like, you know, where do we fit? Doing work on research culture in science, in order to be taken seriously in science, you almost have to be a scientist. You have to be able to talk the same language. I think our brains are formed the same way through science education, and yet science education generally doesn't teach you to reflect or to do any process work, I guess, or understand who you are and where you want to be and where you want to go and all of those things. And that's what we're trying to bring into science, this element of reflection. Been doing a project with one of the doctoral training partnerships where we've been introducing reflexivity using very similar methods to the ones Mariam is using in her research groups. And it's really helping to deal with attrition. Attrition is a real problem often for students who are more marginalised, either because of mental health or their race, ethnicity, first gen into higher education. And bringing these methods in is a way to allow people to reflect, to build community. It seems to be more effective than just having a network for people. Had lots of conversations again about how so many people find networks and support groups just quite intimidating, but if you have a purpose behind something, then it's a lot easier to kind of navigate and negotiate. But it is really interesting, and I think one of the things with chemistry and physics that Mariam's moving into is they have different issues. So the kind of idea of how do we sort out research culture, how do we make an inclusive environment where everyone can feel they belong, is we need a different solution in chemistry than we do in physics, and maybe a different solution in astrophysics than we do in another area of physics, that laser physics. I think that's what Jessie does. But making sure that we're not trying to do like a one wheel fits all approach, because everything's a little bit more complicated and complex than that. And another complicating issue is who funds this stuff, because this is a rant that I can definitely go on about for a long time. A lot of work on research culture, and I don't know if it's the same for the other presenters in the session, a lot of research culture. And I think there was definitely a comment, Karen, your comment about where do you get funding for this. It's really hard to get funding on research culture, on any aspect of it, because it's not seen as fundamental research. You know, it's fundamental to research, but it's not seen as fundamental research in itself. So it's seen as an add-on rather than the integral part of the research itself. It's often, when it is funded, it doesn't include buyout or full economic costing. So then it's seen as a lower relation. It has less status than other kinds of research. So it's seen as less important, less worthy. It's kind of seen as something that people will do if they are marginalised on top, over and above their workload. But then that takes away time from their own career progression and their own development as a researcher, because it's not valued. So it's kind of, where do we sit, where do we fit, and how can we change things so that this kind of work is valued for what it is, which is fundamental to research, so that it is recognised and rewarded in the same way as other research areas and other research topics, but also so, I guess, so that we can change things definitely. But how can we keep this in the attention and make sure that research culture work and work around EDI isn't just seen as something everyone can do this? Obviously, it's everyone's responsibility to make the culture and the environment better and more welcoming and inclusive, but that doesn't mean that everyone is an expert in it. So just as we get experts in supramolecular chemistry or astrophysics, we have experts in research culture and EDI, and yet it's seen as something that everyone can do. So I think that's probably about it, Mariam, unless you've got any closing words.
I think that
yeah,
awesome. We can open the floor. You have raised so many questions that I don't know if you want to finish with some more to add to what Jennifer said, but
happy to go to questions. That'd be great. yeah.
So Jennifer raised a lot of questions. I don't know if
pardon?
someone here wants
thank
to.
Jane. I'll head back over then. Okay.
I don't know if someone here wants to discuss them with Mariam and Jennifer. Mariam, sorry.
Sorry, I do apologise. I can't find the putting my
I
hand.
don't know who we speak. Oh, Sarah,
Yeah.
okay.
I do
You
apologise.
are welcome, Sarah.
Is it all right if I
Yeah, of course.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch all of that because my gas supply's gone off. So I've got an emergency engineer here. So I'm really sorry. I've got the beginning and the end. And thank you, Marianne and Jennifer. I mean, it's really, really interesting and important work. I suppose what I'm picking up on is the issue about research funding and research culture. Because of, the fact that in the REF, and, that's a great driver, isn't it? The REF, we're going to have an increased proportion of the assessment on research culture. I think you'll find that actually, there will be more scope and more hope for research funding in this area.
The conference listening.
We can hope. I mean, I have to say, I don't know. There's been such a pushback on this. It'll be interesting to see how it lands. But also, I think there's going to be a lot of stratification between the universities that can spend money on research culture and those that are struggling financially and just don't have the money or the funds. I think there's going to be, or I fear that there's going to be more early identification of people that it's worth investing in. The kinds of people that we were hearing about in the last talk. So if you go to an elite university and you've got this elite career pathway, they'll be invested in, and that will be to the detriment of any researcher who's marginalized or goes to a post-92 or, doesn't know how to navigate the system or disabled. If your trajectory isn't extremely sharp and fast immediately, I think it's going to be harder to get into a supportive research culture. So I put all of this in my response to the ref that went via NADSIN, but I'm yes, it's good that places are focusing on research culture, but I don't know if it's going to have all of the intended outcomes. And similarly with Wellcome's emphasis on research culture for 25% of all of their discovery awards. Again, it's often seen as an add-on. Everyone can do this, but it actually takes real knowledge in order to do it properly. Otherwise, we just keep reinventing the wheel and we're just having the same things that haven't worked again and again and again. Let's fix the women. Let's fix the Black people. Let's fix the disabled. So I think it's positive, but let's with caution.
Yeah, I would reiterate what Jennifer said and just add that I think I'm much less experienced in general terms doing my PhD, but I think it's a shame that these things always happen as a mandatory tick box exercise. If funding does increase, it will only be because this pressure has been applied to institutions and not necessarily because they do actually care more about academic culture, which is a shame, but we'll see what direction it goes in.
So, Sandra, please. Sandra, please.
Yeah, thank you. My colleagues and I have been doing a study in Canada of women academics and in different universities in the province of Ontario. And we've been looking at their research funding and related questions. And among other things, one finding that stood out to me in particular is that a lot of levels of just going to say happiness, but there are variations according to which university people are located in. We're looking at the social sciences, but it would probably be the same for this point. And the people who are in those elite universities we were hearing about have also a lot of staff assistants. There are people who are professional staff who do a lot of work to help them get their research projects through. And they will help get that insider knowledge of, no, you don't put this paragraph before that paragraph, or it'll just, they won't read any further. That kind of knowledge that isn't necessarily written down somewhere. We looked at successful researchers, and they were located, some in those elite universities, relatively elite, street anyway. And some were in these more undergraduate universities where they had nothing like that level of support. And you could see that people that ended up in those universities who were star researchers, who might have been hired for a particular purpose, were really getting frustrated because they couldn't get anybody to find them a room for their research fellow, and or the money they were supposed to be getting wasn't coming. And in the universities that were kind of mixed, they had lots of research going on, but they weren't to those top ones. You got, understandably, kind of mixed experiences. Some people managed to find someone really good to help them, and others said there's nothing, no support, nothing's happening. So to me, it's a counter to blame the women. It's like blame the institution, because that came out pretty strongly. We're doing a symposium on Thursday morning at 9 o'clock. Not just on that project, but based on a book that we're contributing to that's basically on gender and research funding. So if you're actually in person, come along and be the audience for that.
Thank you. That sounds fascinating. And unfortunately, I'm not there in person. I'm still teaching this week, so I'm there. I think one of the things that I've learned definitely through getting more involved in research culture is this huge disparity of support.
Yes.
Some people have, their job is literally to write grant applications. So you might have a researcher that's got the idea, and then they get a huge amount of support to write it and to finesse it. Whereas others, you're literally someone cobbling it together. I think one of the things I suggested to welcome was there should just be a box to tick to say, yes, I've had support putting this application in, and then also a place to name everybody who has contributed, which would help get recognition for all of the research professionals who often go completely unrecognized. They've put in so much work. But, if you are on a research professional services contract, there's no route for progression. There's very little recognition for the work that you do. In terms of things like impact case studies in the ref over here, so many of them were written by professional services staff and they're not named anywhere, So I think having a box and naming all the people would help bring some kind of awareness to all of the support that is needed to make research happen, but also help recognise those staff. Because I think if we want to have an equitable research environment, we can't just focus on academics. We can't just focus on PhD students. We can't just focus on postdocs, because we know that so many don't end up in an academic role because the price that is asked is just too high.
Yeah, we interviewed research administrators as well. So I'd have something to say about that. And also in our symposium, we're reflecting the book that's going to be published next year as an SRHE Rutledge series book. And the chapters come from Canada, the UK, Sweden, and Finland. And another thing we discovered is very great differences from one country to another, and from one discipline, as we've heard here, from it to another. So every time you make a generalization about research culture, about funding, it's almost like somebody should be saying, yes, but in this country, there's hardly anywhere you can apply to for social sciences. Oh, in this one, you get lots of money. It turns out to be very complicated and fascinating as well. Thank you.
I'm going to put in a link to a book that came out from the work that we've done with the supramolecular chemists. It's available open access. But again, it's not specifically about research funding. It's much more around building identity and academic identity and how we can navigate that quite a lot through COVID as well. But do have a look at that if that's of interest as well.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
I don't know if anyone has any questions. Mariam? Oh, Karen, please. Just for 2 more minutes, please.
Hi, sorry. I'm not sure it's going to be directly relevant to what you've done in your research, but it's more around the conversation we've just been having around research grant capture and those sorts of issues, and your suggestions for some of the ways we can tackle that. I know in my career I've had numerous grants that I have written and so, you know, that have been very successful. In fact, some of the largest that have been very successful that my name has not gone on at all. So in one very large bid, it was awarded £600,000 about 10 years ago. That was actually taken. It was passed on. I mean, it was very underhand what happened, and it was submitted by a man in a partner institution and awarded money. So, and then I've had 2 other grants that were awarded funding that were sort of institutionally led, but I wrote the different parts of the bids. So, yeah, I think this is something that we should be raising with these funders and certainly with the ref. And I think that there are ways that it can be tackled to some extent, you know, where for example you suggested a tick box, but perhaps when people submit a grant application, they could be more specific about what their actual contribution has been. Like, you know, you have to do this with some journal articles now. You have to say what you actually contributed to that article. Did you conceptualize the idea? Did you write the literature review? Did you conduct the research, etc.? Perhaps we should be more specific.
Yeah, and I mean, it's
yeah,
kind of getting recognition for grants and grant writing is really, you know, it kind of comes back to meritocracy in the last talk as well, doesn't it? This, you know, how can we be meritocratic if we're not actually giving recognition for the work that people do?
Yeah.
So
yeah. Okay.
So do you have any more comments, Jennifer, Mariam, on this? Okay, so I think our session is finished. I would like to thank the presenters for the very provoking and rich presentations, and also the participants for this very engaging contribution to this discussion of these papers. And I will like to wish you all a very rest of the day and of the conference as well. So see you next time. Bye bye. Thank you
very much.
Thank you. See ya.